They forced her to marry a stranger to silence her grief, but Miriam Holloway would soon uncover a betrayal that threatened to take everything from the man who saved her dignity. In Drystone Crossing, a marriage built on pity was about to become the only thing standing between a dying ranch and the man secretly bleeding it dry. Before you write into this story with me, hit like and drop a comment with the city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels tonight. Now, let's begin. The wind in Drystone Crossing carried dust the color of old bone, and on the morning Miriam Holloway buried what was left of her old life, that wind didn't care one bit about her sorrow. It just blew, the way it always did, scraping past the general store, rattling the tin sign above the feed mill, pushing tumbleweed against the legs of men who stood outside the church doors, whispering about her like she wasn't 15 feet away. She heard them anyway. She always heard them. "Shame, really," said one woman, fanning herself, though the morning wasn't even hot yet. A woman her size marrying again, you'd think she'd have the decency to stay home. "She buried a husband and a child inside 2 years," another voice answered, lower, almost kind, almost. "Folks like that aren't right in the head no more. Best the council just handles it." Miriam kept her chin level. She'd learned, somewhere in the wreckage of the last 2 years, that the only thing worse than people staring at your pain was letting them see it land. So she walked toward the church steps with her spine straight and her hands folded over the front of a gray dress that had been let out twice now, because grief, it turned out, didn't always make a woman thin. Sometimes it did the opposite. Sometimes a body held on to weight the way it held on to memory, stubborn and unwilling to let go of anything else. She was 34 years old. She had buried a husband named Thomas who died coughing blood into a handkerchief after 2 winters of lung sickness, and she had buried a daughter, 6 years old, who never woke up one frozen February morning. And the town of Drystone Crossing had decided, in its infinite and suffocating wisdom, that a widow without a husband to look after her was a problem requiring a solution. The solution had a name: Elias Thornridge. She didn't know him. She'd seen him exactly twice in 11 years. Once at a barn raising where he'd worked silently in the corner fixing a wagon wheel while other men drank and laughed, and once at the funeral of his own father, where he'd stood at the graveside with his hat in his hands and said nothing to anyone. People called him quiet. People called him broken, too, ever since the accident that left his right leg dragging a half step behind the rest of him, the kind of injury that made a rancher's life twice as hard and his pride twice as heavy to carry. The council, 3 men who fancied themselves guardians of Drystone Crossing's moral order, though Miriam privately thought they guarded little more than their own comfort, had decided that Miriam Holloway, unmarried widow with no children left and no husband to speak for her, was a burden on the town's charity, and Elias Thornridge, struggling alone on a ranch that was sinking faster than anyone wanted to admit, needed a wife to keep his house and, more usefully to the council, needed someone to take off their hands. It was never phrased as an arrangement for Miriam's benefit. Nobody pretended that. "It's practical," old Mr. Caldwell had told her 2 weeks earlier, sitting behind his desk like he was doing her some great favor. "He needs a woman who can run a household. You need a roof that ain't charity. Seems to me the Lord's hand is in it." Miriam hadn't said what she was thinking, which was that the Lord's hand had been remarkably absent the night her daughter stopped breathing, and she didn't much trust it to show up now in the form of a forced marriage to a man she'd never spoken 10 words to in her life. But there was no fighting it. A widow alone in Drystone Crossing had no standing to fight anything. The council controlled the church controlled respectability, and respectability, in a town this small, was the only currency that mattered. So here she was, climbing the steps in a dress that didn't fit right, listening to women murmur about her size and her age, and her bad luck like it was a single disease she carried, walking toward a wedding that the whole town had turned out for. Not to celebrate, but to watch, the way people watched a hanging. Inside the church was half full, more people than she expected, and she understood immediately why. They hadn't come for her. They'd come for the spectacle. A plus-size widow and a crippled rancher, paired off by the town council like livestock at auction. That was entertainment in a place where entertainment was thin on the ground. Elias Thornridge was already standing at the front when she walked in. He was taller than she remembered, lean in the way men got when work ate more than they could put back into their bodies, with a face that had been handsome once, and was now simply weathered, lines carved deep around eyes that didn't quite meet hers when she approached. He wore a clean shirt, the kind a man saves for funerals, and his hat sat in his hands instead of on his head. His right leg was angled slightly, the old injury keeping his stance uneven. But he stood like a man determined not to let anyone see him favor it. He didn't smile. Neither did she. There was nothing in this room worth smiling about. The preacher, a thin man named Reverend Tate, who looked like he'd rather be anywhere else, cleared his throat and began. Miriam barely heard the words. She was aware of the murmuring behind her. Not whispers anymore, some of them not even bothering to lower their voices. "Look at the size of her," a man muttered, loud enough to carry. "Thornridge must be desperate. She'll eat him out of house and home," someone laughed. "Poor man can barely feed his cattle. Now he's got 2 mouths and one of them the size of—" "That's enough." The voice that cut through the church wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. It came from Elias, and it landed in the room like a dropped plate, sharp and final, silencing the laughter mid-breath. Heads turned. Miriam turned too, startled, because in the entire ceremony so far he hadn't said a single unscripted word. He was looking directly at the man who'd spoken, a thick-necked rancher named Hollis Dean, who Miriam vaguely recognized as someone who'd once tried to buy Thornridge land cheap during a bad season and been refused. "You got something to say about my wife," Elias said, voice low, even, but carrying the kind of weight that made the church go dead silent. "You say it to me, not behind her back like a coward hiding in a pew." Hollis Dean's face went red. He opened his mouth, found nothing to say, and closed it again. "She buried a husband and a child," Elias continued, and now his eyes moved across the room, slow, deliberate, daring anyone else to make a sound. "Most of you have buried nothing harder than a bad harvest. So you'll forgive me if I don't much care what any of you think about her, or about this marriage, or about anything else that's none of your business." Nobody answered him. Nobody dared. Miriam stood there, stunned into a kind of paralysis she hadn't expected, because no one, not in 2 years, not since the funerals, not since the whispers started following her down the street like stray dogs, no one had stood up for her like that. Not once. Her own family was 3 states away and hadn't written in a year. The town had treated her grief like a public performance they were entitled to comment on. And this stranger, this quiet rancher she'd exchanged maybe a dozen words with in her whole life, had just told an entire church to shut their mouths on her behalf. She didn't know what to do with that. She didn't trust it, not entirely. Kindness from strangers had a way of curdling once you got close enough to see what was underneath. But something in her chest loosened anyway, just slightly, just enough to let her breathe through the rest of the ceremony without the suffocating weight she'd carried walking in. The vows were short. Reverend Tate, eager to move things along before Elias silenced anyone else, rushed through the words like he was reading off a grocery list. Miriam said, "I do," in a voice that surprised her with its steadiness. Elias said his with his eyes fixed somewhere just past her shoulder, not quite meeting her gaze, like he wasn't sure he had the right to look at her directly yet. And then it was done. Married. Just like that, in a church full of people who'd come to watch her humiliation and instead watched a man defend her honor. Outside, the wind hadn't stopped. The town hadn't changed its opinion either. Miriam could feel that clearly enough, watching the way people filed out of the church giving her sideways looks, some pitying, some still openly judging. But none of them said another word out loud. Elias had made sure of that. He approached her on the steps, hat back on his head now, leaning slightly on his bad leg. "I apologize for that back there," he said. His voice, up close, was rougher than she expected, weathered like the rest of him. "Wasn't how I wanted the day to go." "You didn't do anything wrong," Miriam said. "They did." He studied her for a moment, like he was recalculating something. "Most folks expect a woman to just take it. The talk, the looks. You don't seem the type." "I buried my daughter," Miriam said, and her voice didn't shake, though it cost her something to keep it from shaking. "There's nothing left in this town that can hurt me worse than that already has. Their opinions are just noise." Something shifted in his face. Not quite a smile, but something close to respect. "Well," he said, "wagons this way. It's a few hours out to the ranch. I figured you'd want to get settled before dark." "I'd like that," she said, and meant it. mostly because anywhere was better than standing in front of this church for another minute. The ride out to Thornridge Ranch took most of the afternoon, the wagon creaking over dry, rutted road, the Montana sky stretching wide and merciless overhead, bleached pale by a sun that hadn't given the land a decent rain in longer than anyone could remember. Miriam sat beside Elias in a silence that wasn't entirely uncomfortable, watching the landscape change from the cluttered storefronts of Dry Stone Crossing to open range, fences leaning at odd angles, cattle scattered thin across grass that looked more brown than green. "Drought's bad this year," Elias said eventually, breaking the quiet. "Worse than last. Creek's down to about half what it should be. How long since it last rained proper?" "Going on 4 months." He said it flatly, like a man reciting a fact he'd stopped letting hurt him, though Miriam suspected that wasn't entirely true. "We'll manage. Always have." She glanced at his leg, at the way he held it stiff against the wagon's jolting, and didn't ask the question sitting on her tongue. Not yet. There'd be time enough later to learn the shape of his pain, and she had plenty of her own she wasn't eager to hand over to a stranger on their wedding day. The ranch came into view as the sun started its slow drop toward the western hills. A house that had clearly once been handsome, white paint long since faded to gray, a porch with one railing missing, a barn that leaned slightly to the east like it was tired of standing straight. Cattle grazed in scattered clusters across pasture that should have supported twice their number, and even from the wagon Miriam could see fences in need of mending, a well house with a door hanging off one hinge, the general air of a place that had been fighting a losing battle for longer than its owner wanted to admit. It wasn't despair she felt, looking at it. It was something closer to recognition. She'd looked at her own life over the past 2 years and seen the same kind of slow collapse, things falling apart one piece at a time, faster than any single person could keep up with the repairs. "It's not much," Elias said, and there was an edge of something defensive in his voice, like he expected her to comment on it the way the town had commented on her. "Used to be better? Before the leg." "It has good bones," Miriam said simply, and watched him glance at her, surprised, like he'd expected criticism and gotten something else instead. "Bones can be built on. It's the foundation that matters." He didn't answer that, but something in his shoulders eased just a fraction, the way a man's shoulders ease when he realizes he's not about to be mocked in his own home. Inside, the house was worse than the outside suggested. Not dirty, exactly. Elias clearly tried to keep some order, but neglected in the particular way a house gets neglected when the person living in it is too exhausted and too injured to manage more than survival. Dishes piled by a wash basin, a layer of dust on every surface that hadn't been touched in weeks. A single bedroom, which Elias gestured to with obvious discomfort. "You'll take the bed," he said quickly. "I'll bunk in the front room. Until—" He stopped, cleared his throat. "Until things are different." Miriam appreciated that he didn't pretend otherwise, didn't act like their marriage came with expectations she hadn't agreed to. "That's fine," she said. "Thank you." That first night, after Elias had retreated to the front room and the house had gone quiet except for the wind whirring at the windows, Miriam lay awake in an unfamiliar bed in an unfamiliar house, married to a man she barely knew, and let herself, finally, feel the full weight of the day. She thought of Thomas, of the gentle way he used to hum while he worked, off-key and unconcerned about it. She thought of her daughter, Sarah, 6 years old and gone, the kind of loss that didn't heal so much as it became a permanent resident inside your chest, something you learned to carry rather than something you got over. She didn't cry. She'd done enough of that in private these past 2 years to have run dry of easy tears. Instead, she lay there and made herself a promise, the same promise she'd made walking into the church that morning. She would not be a burden. Whatever this marriage was, whatever the town expected of her, whatever Elias Thornridge himself expected, she would not simply exist inside this house like a piece of unwanted furniture the council had delivered. She had survived worse than a struggling ranch. She intended to prove it. The next morning, she woke before dawn, the way she always had, even in the depths of her grief, because grief had never managed to take her habit of rising early. She found the kitchen in the gray pre-light and began, without asking permission, to clean. By the time Elias limped in an hour later, drawn by the unfamiliar sounds of activity, he found his kitchen transformed, dishes washed and stacked, the floor swept, a fire going in the stove and the smell of coffee filling the small space. He stood in the doorway, clearly startled. "You didn't have to do all this." "I wanted to," Miriam said, not looking up from the bread dough she was working. "I'm not the kind of woman who sits idle, Mr. Thornridge." "Elias," he said, "if we're married, you can drop the mister." "Elias, then." She glanced at him, at the way he leaned against the doorframe to take the weight off his bad leg, and something practical clicked into place in her mind, the same instinct that had once made her manage her own household with quiet efficiency before grief had stripped that purpose away. "Sit down. You're not doing your leg any favors standing there." He looked like he wanted to argue, the way proud men do when a woman tells them what's good for their own body. But he sat anyway, lowering himself into a chair with the careful, practiced movement of someone who'd learned exactly how much his injury would tolerate before it punished him for forgetting. Over coffee, in the gray early light, Miriam asked the question she'd been holding back. "What happened to your leg?" Elias was quiet for a long moment, turning his cup slowly on the table. "Horse spooked 2 years back. Threw me into a fence post. Broke it bad enough the doctor in town said I was lucky to keep the leg at all." He flexed his fingers around the cup. "Wasn't lucky enough to keep it working right, though. Some days it's fine. Some days it locks up and I'm no good for anything but sitting. And the ranch has been failing since." It wasn't a question, and his eyes came up sharply, like he hadn't expected her to say it so plainly. "Folks usually dance around that part." "I'm not interested in dancing," Miriam said. "I've buried 2 people I loved more than my own life. I don't have patience left for pretending things are better than they are." Something passed across his face. Surprise, maybe? Or the first thread of something like genuine respect. "No," he admitted. "It has. Cattle prices dropped the same year I got hurt. Hired a man to help manage the books and the herd since I couldn't do it all myself anymore, and he's kept us from going under entirely, but..." He trailed off, shook his head. "Some years it feels like I'm just delaying the inevitable. Drought this bad doesn't help." "Who's the man? The one managing things?" "Silas Granger." Elias said the name with a kind of unthinking trust that made Miriam file it away without comment. "Known him near 20 years. He's the only reason this place is still standing, far as I can tell. Handles the books, the buyers, the bank. I'd have lost everything without him after the accident." Miriam nodded slowly, sipping her coffee, saying nothing more on the subject, though something in the back of her mind, the same instinct that had once managed every dollar of her late husband's modest income with careful precision, the same instinct that noticed when numbers didn't quite add up the way they should, filed the name away for later. She didn't know Silas Granger. She had no reason yet to distrust him, but she'd learned over the long, hard years of her life that trust offered too freely was usually trust given to people who hadn't earned it, and a man who managed every dollar of a struggling rancher's affairs, with that rancher too injured and too exhausted to check the work closely, was exactly the kind of arrangement that made her instincts itch. She said nothing of it that morning. There would be time. The first weeks at Thornridge Ranch settled into a rhythm that surprised Miriam with how quickly it came to feel less like servitude and more like purpose. She rose before dawn, kept the house running with the same quiet competence she'd once brought to her life with Thomas, and slowly, methodically, began to understand the shape of the operation Elias was fighting to keep alive. The town, predictably, hadn't softened in its opinion of her. On the rare occasions she rode into Drystone Crossing for supplies, she felt the same eyes, heard the same half-muffled comments, watched the same women cross the street rather than walk past her directly. But something had shifted, subtly, in how people approached the subject of Elias. Word of what he'd said in the church had traveled, the way everything traveled in a small town, and there was a wary respect now mixed in with the judgment. Nobody wanted to be the next person Elias Thornridge called out in public. Miriam didn't need their respect. She'd stopped needing it the day Sarah died, when she'd realized that the opinions of people who'd never once brought a meal to her door or sat with her through a sleepless night weren't worth the energy it took to care about them. What she needed was purpose, and the ranch, struggling and threadbare as it was, gave her exactly that. She started small, reorganizing the kitchen, mending curtains, scrubbing 2 years of bachelor neglect out of every corner of the house. But her attention kept drifting, almost against her will, toward the ledger book she found shoved into a drawer in the front room. Water-stained, dog-eared, filled with Elias's cramped handwriting in the early pages and a different, neater hand in the later ones. Silas Granger's handwriting, she assumed. She didn't open it that first week. It wasn't her place, not yet, and some careful, self-protective part of her recognized that pulling at a thread before she understood the whole garment could unravel more than she intended. But she noticed things. The way Elias flinched slightly whenever feed costs came up in conversation. The way cattle counts, when he mentioned them, never quite matched the numbers she overheard at the feed store when other ranchers compared notes. The way Silas Granger, when he rode out to the ranch every other week with papers for Elias to sign, never lingered long enough for any real conversation. Always business, always brisk, always gone again within the hour. "He's a busy man," Elias said once, when Miriam asked, carefully, neutral, why Silas never stayed for supper. "Manages affairs for half the ranchers in the county. Doesn't have time to sit around." "Must be good at his work, then, managing so many at once." "Best there is," Elias said, and there was something almost grateful in his voice. The gratitude of a man who'd been drowning and found someone willing to throw him a rope, even if he'd never quite stopped to examine how tightly that rope was tied. "Don't know where I'd be without him." Miriam smiled and said nothing more. And that night, after Elias had gone to bed and the house had settled into its usual creaking silence, she lit a candle, sat down at the kitchen table, and finally opened the ledger. She read by candlelight for hours, the numbers swimming slightly in the dim light, but even through her exhaustion, certain patterns began to surface. Small at first, easy to dismiss as coincidence, but accumulating the longer she studied. Feed purchases that seemed disproportionately high compared to the size of the herd Elias described. Payments to suppliers she didn't recognize, routed through accounts with names that meant nothing to her. Cattle sale numbers that, when she cross-referenced them against vague mentions Elias had made of herd size over their conversations, simply didn't add up. It wasn't proof of anything. Not yet. Ranching finances were complicated, full of seasonal fluctuations and market variables she didn't fully understand, and she was careful not to let suspicion calcify into certainty before she had real evidence. But the unease she'd felt that first morning, hearing Elias speak Silas Granger's name with such unquestioning trust, had hardened into something more deliberate, a decision, quiet and private, that she would keep watching. She would keep reading. She would learn this ranch's true condition with her own eyes, not through the filtered reports of a man who visited twice a month and never stayed long enough to be questioned. She closed the ledger before midnight, blew out the candle, and sat for a moment in the dark kitchen, listening to the wind outside scraping against dry grass, thinking of her daughter's small hands, of her husband's voice humming off-key, of all the things she'd lost that she couldn't get back, no matter how carefully she studied the ledgers of her own grief. But this ranch, this struggling, stubborn man who'd stood up for her in a church full of strangers, this was something she might still be able to save. And if someone was quietly bleeding it dry while Elias was too injured and too trusting to notice, she intended to find out exactly who and exactly how before it was too late for either of them. The weeks that followed brought small, steady changes to Thornridge Ranch, changes the neighbors noticed, even if they wouldn't admit it out loud. The garden behind the house, abandoned since before Elias's accident, came back to life under Miriam's careful hands, vegetables pushing up through soil she'd turned and watered herself, hauling buckets from the diminished creek with a determination that left her hands blistered and her back aching by sundown. The chickens, which had been laying inconsistently, started producing again once she rebuilt their coop and adjusted their feed. Small things. Practical things. The kind of work nobody in town would ever credit her for, but the kind that mattered, day to day, to a household clawing its way back from collapse. Elias noticed. He wasn't a man given to easy compliments, but Miriam began catching him watching her sometimes, across the yard or the kitchen, with an expression she couldn't quite name. Not quite admiration, not quite surprise, something caught between the two, like a man recalculating an equation he thought he'd already solved. "You didn't have to fix the coop," he said one evening, watching her count fresh eggs into a basket. "I'd have gotten to it eventually." "Eventually is a luxury this place doesn't have," Miriam said, not unkindly. "Every week we wait is a week of eggs we don't have to sell or eat. Small things add up, Elias. That's usually how a place falls apart in the first place. Not one big disaster, but 100 small neglects nobody bothered to fix." He was quiet at that, turning the words over, and Miriam wondered, not for the first time, whether he heard the second meaning underneath her words, that she wasn't only talking about chicken coops. Their conversations slowly began to stretch longer. Supper, which had started as a silent, almost businesslike affair in those first awkward days, became something closer to actual companionship. Elias talked, haltingly at first, and then with more ease, about the ranch as it had been before the accident, his father's vision for it, the years of careful building, the herd he'd hoped to grow before his leg, and his luck both gave out at once. Miriam, in turn, found herself talking about Thomas sometimes, about Sarah, in small, careful pieces, testing whether the grief would still cut as deep when spoken aloud to someone who wasn't simply gawking at her pain for entertainment. It never did cut quite the same, she found, when the person listening actually seemed to care. "She sounds like she was something," Elias said one night, after Miriam had told him about Sarah's habit of naming every chicken on their old property, even the ones destined for the supper table, much to Thomas's exasperated amusement. "She was," Miriam said, and for the first time in 2 years, the words came without the familiar suffocating weight behind them. Just memory. Just love, instead of only loss. It was during one of these quiet suppers, 3 weeks into the marriage, that Miriam finally decided to test the waters on the subject that had been sitting, unspoken, at the back of her mind since that first night with the ledger. "Elias," she said carefully, "how often does Silas show you the full accounts? Not just what needs signing, but the whole picture. Every purchase, every sale, every payment going out." He frowned slightly, setting down his fork. "He brings the books out every couple months for me to look over." "Why?" "And do you go through them yourself, line by line?" "Some of it." He shifted, and Miriam could see the discomfort creeping into his posture, the particular discomfort of a man being asked to admit a weakness. "Truth is, the leg makes long stretches at a desk hard some days. Numbers start swimming. Silas knows the business better than I ever did with the books anyway. Handled this kind of thing for half the county. I trust his work." "I'm sure you do," Miriam said gently, not wanting to plant suspicion too forcefully. Not yet. Not until she had more than instinct and a handful of numbers that didn't quite align. "I only ask because I used to keep my husband's accounts, back before. I'm decent with figures. If you'd ever want a second set of eyes on things, not because I doubt Mr. Granger, just so you're not carrying that weight alone, I'd be glad to help." Elias studied her for a long moment, something working behind his eyes. "You'd want to do that? Most women wouldn't have the patience for it. Most women weren't raised by a father who ran a dry goods store and taught his daughter how to balance a register before she could properly write her own name," Miriam said, allowing herself a small smile. "I have more patience for numbers than most people have for me, Elias. It might as well be put to use." He laughed, a short, surprised sound, the first real laugh she'd heard from him since the wedding. "All right. Next time Silas comes by with the books, I'll have him show you too." It was a small victory, but Miriam felt it settle into her chest with real weight. A door opening, however slightly. Access, eventually, to whatever the ledgers were truly hiding. She didn't have to wait long. Silas Granger rode out to the ranch 8 days later, a man somewhere in his 50s, well-dressed in a way that stood out sharply against the threadbare practicality of everyone else in Drystone Crossing, his mustache neatly trimmed, his boots polished despite the dust of the ride. He had an easy, practiced charm about him, the kind that made strangers trust him within minutes of meeting. Exactly the kind of charm, Miriam thought, watching him shake Elias's hand on the porch, that made people stop asking questions long after they should have started. "And this must be the new Mrs. Thornridge," Silas said, turning his smile on Miriam with a warmth that didn't quite reach his eyes. Or maybe she was imagining that, projecting suspicion onto a stranger who'd given her no real reason for it yet. "Heard the whole county talking about your wedding, Elias. Glad to see you've settled in well, ma'am." "Mr. Granger," Miriam said, offering a polite smile of her own, giving away nothing. "Elias tells me you've been keeping this ranch afloat almost single-handed these past 2 years. We're grateful." "Just doing what any friend would," Silas said smoothly, and there was something in the easy way he said it, a little too smooth, a little too rehearsed, that made the suspicion in Miriam's chest tighten rather than ease. They sat at the kitchen table, the ledger book open between them, and Silas walked through the recent entries with the confident, slightly condescending patience of a man explaining simple things to people he assumed wouldn't fully grasp them. Feed costs, he explained, had risen because of the drought. Suppliers were charging more for hay that had to be hauled in from further away as local stock dried up. Cattle losses were attributed to the heat, a few head wandering off or succumbing to the conditions, regrettable but not unusual in a bad year. Payments to a company called Larkspur Trading, which Miriam had specifically circled in her private notes, were explained as a feed and supply contract Silas had negotiated to get Elias better rates than the local mill could offer. It was a smooth, plausible explanation for every single discrepancy Miriam had noted. Too smooth, perhaps. The kind of explanation that answered every question before it was fully asked. The way a man rehearses a story he's told many times before and expects never to be challenged on. "That's mighty thorough," Miriam said, keeping her tone admiring rather than skeptical. "You must keep meticulous records, Mr. Granger." "Have to in this business," Silas said, closing the ledger with a satisfied air, as though the matter were now thoroughly settled. "A rancher's only as good as his books, especially these days." After he left, riding off down the dusty road with the same easy confidence he'd arrived with, Elias turned to Miriam with something like relief on his face. "See? Nothing to worry over. Silas has always run a tight operation." "It does seem that way," Miriam said carefully, not wanting to disturb the fragile trust she'd built with Elias by voicing doubts she couldn't yet prove. "I'm glad to see it for myself." But that night, alone again with the candle and her own private notes, Miriam went back over everything Silas had explained, comparing it line by line against numbers she'd quietly gathered. Gossip from the feed store about current hay prices, comments from a neighboring rancher's wife about typical cattle losses during a bad drought year, her own careful calculations of what the ranch's modest herd should reasonably cost to maintain. The numbers Silas had offered were plausible. They were also, she was now almost certain, wrong. Not wildly, not obviously, but wrong in the careful, deliberate way of a man who understood that a small, consistent skim drew far less attention than one large, suspicious theft. Larkspur Trading, in particular, nagged at her. She'd never heard the name mentioned by anyone else in the county, not at the feed store, not among the other ranchers' wives she'd begun cautiously befriending during her trips into town. A supplier that existed only in Elias Thornridge's ledger and nowhere else in Drystone Crossing's commerce was not a coincidence. It was a hiding place. She didn't sleep much that night, turning the pieces over in her mind, weighing the danger of what she suspected against the danger of staying silent. If she was wrong, she risked planting doubt that could poison the one relationship Elias trusted most in the world, the lifeline he believed had kept his ranch standing through the worst years of his life. If she was right, every week of silence was another week of theft, another week of the ranch's slow bleeding continuing unchecked, while the man responsible smiled and shook hands and called himself a friend. She thought of her father, behind the counter of his dry goods store, teaching her to read a column of figures before she could read a full sentence. She thought of Thomas, trusting and gentle, the kind of man who'd never once questioned a bill that came due, leaving her to quietly catch the mistakes before they became disasters. She thought finally of Sarah, and of the particular fierce protectiveness that had lived in her chest since the day her daughter was born, a fire that hadn't died with Sarah, only gone looking, ever since, for something else to protect. This ranch. This stubborn, struggling, decent man who'd stood in a church full of cruel strangers and refused to let them hurt her. She would not let it be stolen out from under him while she sat by and said nothing. By the time the candle burned down to nothing and gray dawn crept through the kitchen window, Miriam Holloway Thornridge had made her decision. She would gather proof, real proof, undeniable proof, the kind that couldn't be explained away with a smooth voice and a confident smile, before she ever spoke a word of accusation to anyone. She would travel to the county offices herself if she had to, dig through public records, ask careful questions of people who had no reason to lie to her. She would not move too fast, would not give Silas Granger any reason to suspect she was watching, not until she had enough to make the truth impossible to dismiss. The town of Drystone Crossing had spent years deciding Miriam Holloway was a burden, an uneducated, overweight widow with nothing left to offer the world but pity and inconvenience. She thought of their faces in the church, the laughter, the whispered cruelty. and felt something settle into place inside her chest. Not anger exactly, though there was plenty of that too, but resolve, cold and steady and absolute. They had underestimated her every single time. Silas Granger, riding away from the ranch with his polished boots and his rehearsed explanations, had no idea yet that he'd just made the same mistake. Outside, the wind kept blowing across the dry Montana grass, carrying dust toward a horizon that hadn't seen real rain in 4 months. Inside the small, struggling house at Thornridge Ranch, Miriam closed her notebook, blew out the last flicker of the candle, and allowed herself for the first time since burying her daughter to feel something close to purpose burning steady in her chest. Quiet, careful, and entirely unstoppable. The morning after she made her decision, Miriam rose before the sun the way she always did. But something had changed in the way she moved through the kitchen, a sharpness to her attention that hadn't been there the week before. She watched Elias eat his breakfast, watched the easy trust still sitting in his shoulders whenever Silas Granger's name came up in passing conversation, and she said nothing of what she'd resolved in the dark hours of the night. Not yet. It took her 4 days to find a reason to ride into town without raising questions. "I need thread and a few other things from the dry goods store," she told Elias over breakfast, which was true enough, though it wasn't the whole truth. "And I thought I'd stop by the county clerk's office, see about getting my name properly added to things now that we're married, records and such." Elias barely looked up from his coffee. "Take the wagon. Horse could use the exercise anyway." It was almost insultingly easy, how little anyone questioned a woman claiming errands. Miriam had spent 34 years learning that people rarely looked twice at a woman doing what was expected of her, and for the first time in her life, she found a use for that particular blindness. The county clerk's office sat at the end of Dry Stone Crossing's main street, a squat brick building that smelled like old paper and pipe tobacco, manned by a thin, balding clerk named Mr. Pruitt, who'd been recording the county's business for longer than Miriam had been alive. She made her request sound simple, updating her name on record, nothing more. And while Mr. Pruitt shuffled through forms, she let her eyes wander casually toward the shelves of public ledgers behind his desk. "Mr. Pruitt," she said, keeping her voice light, "I don't suppose property tax records are available for public viewing? My husband's been after me to understand our standing better, since I do the household accounts now." It wasn't quite a lie. It wasn't quite the truth either. "Of course, ma'am. Public record. Every bit of it." He gestured toward a side table. "Anything filed gets logged in those books there. Help yourself, just mind you put things back where you found them." It took her nearly 2 hours, hunched over dusty ledgers in poor light, but what she found confirmed the unease that had been building in her chest for weeks. Thornridge Ranch's tax filings, cross-referenced against the figures she'd memorized from Elias's own books, didn't align. Not wildly, nothing that would catch a careless eye, but enough that a woman who'd spent her whole life balancing columns of numbers could see the seams where the two stories diverged. More than that, she found a name. Larkspur Trading Company, the mysterious supplier Silas had cited as the source of so many of the ranch's recent expenses, had no filing anywhere in the county records. No business license, no tax registration, no address on file with the clerk's office at all. A company that bought and sold goods worth hundreds of dollars a year and didn't exist as far as the county was concerned. Miriam sat very still for a long moment after that discovery, the dust motes drifting in the window light, her pulse beating a little too fast in her throat. It was one thing to suspect. It was another thing entirely to hold proof in her hands, even proof as small and circumstantial as an absent filing. She didn't stop there. She visited the bank next, a modest brick building with a teller who recognized her, barely, as the new Mrs. Thornridge, married into a name the bank clearly knew well. Miriam asked, with the same careful, harmless phrasing she'd used at the clerk's office, whether she might review recent account activity, now that she was managing household affairs alongside her husband. The teller hesitated, glanced toward the back office, and said he'd need to check with the bank manager. The bank manager, a heavy-set man named Walter Briggs, came out a few minutes later with an expression that told Miriam everything before he said a single word. Careful, guarded, the look of a man deciding how much trouble a question was worth answering honestly. "Mrs. Thornridge," he said, shaking her hand with a grip that lingered a beat too long, like he was trying to read something off her face. "Don't believe we've had the pleasure. Elias, well, I hope." Well enough, Miriam said. I'm hoping to review the ranch's recent transactions. I understand my husband authorized Mr. Granger to manage the accounts, but as his wife, I'd like to understand our standing for myself. Briggs's smile didn't waver, but something behind his eyes went carefully blank. Normally that'd be no trouble at all, ma'am. Only Mr. Granger holds power of attorney over those particular accounts. Elias signed the authorization himself, back after his accident. I'm afraid I'd need Mr. Granger's consent or your husband's direct request in writing before I could open those books to anyone else. Even his own wife, Briggs said, not unkindly but firmly. It's just policy, ma'am, nothing personal in it. Miriam thanked him, kept her face pleasant and unbothered, and walked back out into the harsh afternoon light with her heart hammering against her ribs. Power of attorney. She hadn't known that, hadn't realized how completely Elias had handed over control of his own finances to a man he trusted out of desperation and exhaustion 2 years ago, signing away oversight of his own ranch without ever imagining he'd need to take it back. It explained everything. The smooth confidence Silas wore like a second skin, the ease with which he closed the ledger book and considered every question already answered. He wasn't merely managing the books. He held legal authority over them. Authority that made it nearly impossible for anyone, even Elias himself, to dig deeper without Silas's cooperation. She didn't tell Elias what she'd learned that night. She told herself it was caution, the need for more proof before risking the fragile trust between them. But some smaller, more honest part of her admitted it was also fear. Fear of what it would do to him. A man already broken by one betrayal of his body. To learn that the person who'd held his ranch together after the accident might be the same person quietly tearing it apart. She kept digging instead. Over the following 2 weeks, she found reasons to ride into town again and again. Supplies, church. On Sundays, she no longer dreaded quite so much now that the whispers had grown thinner. Conversations struck up carefully with the wives of other ranchers, women who'd initially regarded her with the same wary judgment as the rest of the town, but who'd slowly, grudgingly, begun to soften toward the woman who'd married Elias Thornridge and hadn't run screaming from the work of it. From one such woman, a sharp-eyed rancher's wife named Dorothy Pike, she learned something that turned her unease into something closer to dread. Larkspur trading? Dorothy repeated, frowning over the washing line where they'd both come to hang laundry on the same windy stretch of fence between properties. Can't say I know it. We've used Halloran's Feed and Supply out near the rail spur for years, same as most folks round here. Never heard of any larkspur. Mr. Granger arranged it for us. Said he'd gotten Elias a better rate. Dorothy's expression flickered, something careful crossing her weathered face. Silas Granger manages your books too, then? Has for 2 years. Dorothy hung another shirt, not quite meeting Miriam's eyes. He handled my brother-in-law's accounts a few years back, before my brother-in-law lost the ranch and moved his family out to Wyoming. Miriam went very still. Lost the ranch how? Bank foreclosed. Said the debts had piled up faster than anyone realized, on account of some water rights dispute that ate up whatever savings he had left, fighting it in court. Dorothy shrugged, though there was something uneasy in the gesture, like she'd thought about this before and never quite let herself finish the thought. Always seemed strange to me how fast it all fell apart, considering how steady that ranch had run for years before. But that's not really my business to speculate on. I suppose it was, Miriam thought, walking back to the wagon with her basket of dry laundry and her mind racing, exactly her business to speculate on. A pattern wasn't a coincidence once it repeated. A ranch lost to debts that appeared faster than they should have, a water rights dispute that drained whatever resources remained, and at the center of both stories, the same name, the same trusted manager, the same easy explanations that answered every question before it was properly asked. She needed to see the water rights documents for Thornridge Ranch. The thought arrived with a cold, sinking certainty, the final piece sliding into place in a puzzle she'd been assembling for weeks without quite seeing the whole shape of it. It took her another careful week to find the opportunity, waiting for a day when Elias rode out with one of the hired hands to check on a section of fence line 3 miles south, leaving her alone at the house with the kind of stretch of free hours she rarely had. She didn't go to the clerk's office that day. She'd already combed through what records were freely available there, and water rights filings she'd learned from a careful, roundabout conversation with Mr. Pruitt were handled separately through the territorial land office in the county seat, a half-day's ride further north. She made the trip alone, telling Elias only that she needed to visit a seamstress in the county seat for proper mourning alterations to address. A lie that sat uneasy in her stomach but felt necessary all the same. The ride was long and dusty, the kind of solitary travel that left plenty of room for doubt to creep in, but Miriam kept her resolve fixed the way she'd once fixed her grief, refusing to let it waver no matter how heavy it sat. The land office clerk, a younger man than Pruitt, more easily flattered, took less convincing to let her review the filings on Thornridge Ranch's water rights. What she found there made her hands go cold despite the heat of the afternoon. The original filing, dated back to Elias's father's time, granted Thornridge Ranch primary rights to draw from Cutter Creek, the modest but reliable waterway that ran along the eastern edge of the property. The same creek Elias had mentioned, the one running at half its usual level this terrible drought year, but still, crucially, the ranch's only dependable water source. But there was a second filing, more recent, dated only 8 months earlier, bearing a signature that was unmistakably Elias's own, and yet utterly unfamiliar to Miriam, who'd spent enough evenings now watching her husband sign receipts and letters to know the particular slant and weight of his actual handwriting. It wasn't his signature. It was close enough to fool a clerk processing dozens of filings a week, close enough to fool anyone who wasn't looking specifically for the small, telling differences. But it wasn't his hand. The filing transferred primary water rights away from Thornridge Ranch and toward a secondary claimant, Larkspur Trading Company, the same name that didn't exist anywhere in the county's business records, the same name Silas Granger had used to explain away 2 years of mysterious expenses. Once finalized, the filing would leave Thornridge Ranch with only secondary access to Cutter Creek, access that during a drought this severe, with primary rights now held by someone else, would amount to almost nothing at all. Elias would lose his only reliable water source in the worst dry season in living memory, and a ranch already buckling under that loss would have no choice but to sell, cheap and fast, to whoever happened to be in a position to buy. Miriam sat in the land office for a long moment, the document trembling slightly in her hands, understanding with sudden, sick clarity exactly what she was looking at. This wasn't simple theft anymore. This was a slow, deliberate dismantling of everything Elias Thornridge had left, engineered by a man he trusted like family, timed to finish its work in exactly the season when Elias would have no resources left to fight it. "Ma'am?" the clerk asked, noticing her stillness. "Everything in order?" "When does this filing become final?" she asked, her voice steadier than she felt. The clerk checked the paperwork. 60-day waiting period for objections, then it's finalized automatic unless somebody contests it formal, with the original signatory present. He glanced at the date. "Looks like that window closes in about 3 weeks." 3 weeks. Miriam rode back to Thornridge Ranch that evening with the document copied carefully into her own notebook, her mind working through every possible angle, every risk, every consequence of what she now knew. She arrived home after dark, the house lit by a single lamp in the front window, Elias waiting up despite the late hour, worry playing on his face when she finally walked through the door. "You're later than I expected," he said, rising from his chair with the careful, uneven gait of his bad leg. Was starting to think something had happened. "Something has happened," Miriam said, and found that her hands were shaking now, the careful composure she'd held for the entire ride home finally beginning to crack. "Elias, sit down. There's something you need to see, and I need you to hear all of it before you say anything." He sat slowly, watching her face with growing alarm. "Miriam, you're scaring me." "I should have told you sooner," she said, pulling out her notebook, her hands still trembling as she laid it open on the table between them. "I should have come to you the first night I noticed something wrong with the books, but I didn't want to accuse a man you trust without proof, and I was afraid of what it would do to you if I was wrong." "I'm not wrong, Elias. I wish to every star in that sky I was wrong." She told him everything then, in the lamplit kitchen with the wind moaning soft against the windows, the way she always seemed to tell him the truths that mattered most, the ledger discrepancies she'd first noticed weeks ago, the non-existent Larkspur Trading Company, the bank's power of attorney that locked him out of his own accounts, Dorothy Pike's brother-in-law and his lost ranch. And finally, the forged signature, the stolen water rights, the 3-week window closing fast on whatever chance they had left to fight it. Elias didn't say anything for a long time after she finished. He sat very still, staring at the notebook, at the careful copied document with its forged signature, his jaw working like a man trying to swallow something too large and too bitter to go down easy. 20 years, he said finally, his voice rough, almost a whisper. I've known that man 20 years. He stood at my father's funeral. He's the reason I didn't lose everything after the accident, or so I thought. And the whole time, he stopped, pressed his hand flat against the table like he needed something solid to hold on to. The whole time he's been robbing me blind and setting up to take the rest. I know how it feels, Miriam said quietly. To trust someone completely and have that trust turn out to be the thing that nearly destroys you. I know exactly how that feels, Elias. He looked up at her then, something raw and unguarded in his expression, stripped of the careful composure he usually wore like armor. Why didn't you tell me sooner? Because I was afraid, she admitted. Afraid you wouldn't believe me. Afraid I'd be wrong and ruin the one relationship that's kept this ranch breathing these past 2 years. Afraid, if I'm honest, that you'd look at me the way the rest of this town looks at me. Like a woman too foolish and too desperate to know the difference between sense and suspicion. I'd never think that, Elias said, and there was something fierce in the way he said it, something that reminded her of the church, of the moment he'd silenced an entire room on her behalf. Miriam, look at me. I'd never think that of you. You might have before, she said, before you knew me. I know you now. He reached across the table, not quite touching her hand, but close. Close enough that she could feel the warmth of him even in the gap between them. And I believe you. Every word of it. God help me. I believe you. And I don't know whether to be grateful or sick to my stomach that it took someone I've known 3 months to see what 20 years of friendship blinded me to completely. Both, probably, Miriam said, and despite everything, despite the fear and the anger and the 3-week clock now ticking down on whatever was left of this ranch's future, something in her chest eased slightly at the way he was looking at her. Not with doubt, not with the suspicion the rest of the town had trained her to expect, but with something that looked unmistakably like trust freely given. What do we do? Elias asked, and the question carried weight beyond its simple words, an acknowledgement that this was no longer his fight alone, that whatever happened next, they would face it together. Miriam closed the notebook carefully, her mind already racing ahead through the weeks to come. The evidence still needed, the attorney they'd have to find and trust, with documents that could expose a man with 20 years of standing in this county. The 3-week window closing faster with every hour they spent simply absorbing the shock of betrayal instead of moving against it. We fight, she said simply, carefully and quietly, until we have enough that Silas Granger can't smile his way out of it. And then we fight loud enough that the whole county hears every word. Outside, the Montana wind kept blowing across the parched, drought-starved land, carrying dust toward a horizon neither of them could yet see clearly, toward a reckoning that was coming whether either of them felt ready for it or not. Elias reached across the table again, and this time he did take her hand, his grip rough and uncertain but steady. The grip of a man choosing, deliberately, to stand beside someone instead of facing ruin alone. It was, Miriam thought, the first time in 2 years that anyone had chosen to stand beside her instead of simply watching her carry her burdens by herself. Whatever came next, whatever Silas Granger had built on 20 years of careful deception, they would face it together, and for the first time since the church doors had opened on her wedding day. That thought didn't feel like fear at all. They moved fast after that night, faster than either of them felt ready for, because the 3-week window left no room for anything else. Miriam wrote to an attorney in the county seat the very next morning, a careful letter that revealed just enough to secure his interest without putting the full weight of their evidence on paper where it might be intercepted or lost. His name was Joseph Caro, a man Dorothy Pike had mentioned in passing once, with the particular respect reserved for someone who'd taken on a land dispute against powerful interests and won. Miriam didn't know if he'd take their case. She only knew they needed someone who wouldn't be intimidated by 20 years of Silas Granger's standing in the county. Elias, for his part, threw himself into the work with a grim, focused energy that Miriam hadn't seen in him before. Not even in the weeks she'd watched him push through his bad leg to keep the ranch running. He went through the ledger himself now, every night, comparing entries against the copies Miriam had made of county and bank records. His jaw tight, his temper short in a way it hadn't been before, though never once turned toward her. 20 years, he muttered one night, staring at a column of figures that didn't reconcile no matter how many times he added them. 20 years I called that man a friend. He counted on that, Miriam said gently, setting a cup of coffee in front of him, though it had long since gone cold. Men like Silas don't build trust by accident, Elias. They build it the same careful way they build everything else. Slow, deliberate, exactly the way that makes it easiest to take advantage of later. Doesn't make it hurt less. No, she agreed, it doesn't. They worked in careful silence after that. The kind of silence that had become familiar between them, comfortable even in its weight. Miriam had stopped thinking of the front room as Elias's separate space some weeks back, somewhere in the long evenings of shared worry and shared work, though neither of them had spoken of it directly. They simply existed now in the same rooms, the same problems, the same fragile building trust. And it had happened so gradually that Miriam couldn't point to the exact night it had shifted. Joseph Caro wrote back within the week, agreeing to meet, and Elias rode the half-day journey to the county seat himself this time, leg and all, refusing to let Miriam make the trip alone again. The attorney, when Miriam finally met him in person at a follow-up meeting 2 days later, was younger than she'd expected, sharp-eyed and unhurried in his manner, the kind of man who listened twice as much as he spoke. He reviewed their evidence in near silence, the ledger comparisons, the absent Larkspur trading filing, the forged water rights document, Dorothy Pike's account of her brother-in-law's ruined ranch, for nearly 2 hours, occasionally asking a sharp, precise question that made Miriam realize how carefully he was already building a case in his mind. "This is good work," Caro said finally, closing the folder. "Better than most attorneys see walk through their door. You did this yourself, Mrs. Thornridge?" "Most of it. It shows." He tapped the folder. "The water rights filing is the most urgent matter. That window closes in under 2 weeks now. And once it finalizes, undoing it becomes a much harder fight. Expensive and slow, the kind of fight that drags on for years while your husband's ranch dries up waiting on a judge's calendar. We need to file an objection before that window closes formally, with Elias present to dispute the signature." "And the rest of it?" Elias asked. "The stolen money, the cattle." "That builds the case," Caro said. "The water rights filing alone might get dismissed as an administrative dispute if we can't prove intent. But once we connect it to a pattern, falsified expenses, a fictional company, a documented history with at least one other ranch lost under suspiciously similar circumstances, that's not an accident anymore. That's fraud. That's the kind of case that doesn't just stop a bad filing. That's the kind of case that ends a man's career and puts him in front of a judge for criminal charges." It was, Miriam thought, exactly what needed to happen, and also exactly the kind of fight that came with real danger attached. The kind that wouldn't simply let her and Elias walk away clean once they started pulling at the thread in public. Silas Granger had spent 20 years building his reputation in this county. A man with that much invested in his own respectability wouldn't go down quiet. She was right to worry. It happened 9 days later, in the dead hours before dawn, while the formal objection sat filed and waiting with the land office, while Elias and Miriam thought they had a little time left to gather final pieces of evidence before the confrontation came to a head. The sound woke Miriam first, a low, distant rush of water that didn't belong in a drought this severe, followed by the panicked bawling of cattle and the thunder of hooves moving fast across dry ground. She was up and dressed before Elias had even fully understood what he was hearing, both of them out into the yard within minutes, the eastern sky just beginning to lighten with the first gray edge of dawn. The main water gate, the one controlling the flow from what little remained of Cutter Creek into the ranch's holding pond and grazing fields, stood wide open, the precious remaining water gushing out across dry ground and disappearing into the thirsty earth faster than it could do any good, while what was left of their cattle, spooked by the sudden rush and noise, had scattered wide across open range in the dark. "Son of a—" Elias was already moving, his bad leg forgotten in the urgency, stumbling toward the gate. Someone did this on purpose. This doesn't just come open on its own. Miriam was right behind him, taking in the scene with a coldness that surprised her, even as panic rose in her chest. The gate mechanism had been forced, the lock broken clean, not worn or rusted, but struck with deliberate force. "Elias, This isn't random vandalism. This is a distraction. He turned to look at her, understanding dawning hard and fast across his face. The hearing, the objection. They know we filed it, Miriam said, or they suspect. And if you spend the next 3 days chasing scattered cattle across open range instead of preparing for that hearing, then the filing window might close before I can even show up to contest it properly. Elias's face had gone pale beneath the dust and early sweat. Miriam, half our herd just scattered into country that's dry enough to kill them inside 2 days without water. I can't just leave them out there. It was, Miriam understood immediately, an impossible choice, precisely engineered to be impossible. Protect the cattle that represented their entire livelihood, or protect the legal fight that represented their only chance to keep the ranch at all. Whoever had cut that gate, and she had no real doubt who'd ordered it, even if Silas Granger's own hands had stayed clean of the actual sabotage, had understood exactly how to break a struggling rancher's resolve in a single night. Then we do both, she said, already moving toward the barn. You and the hands go after the cattle. I'll take the evidence to Caro myself today, make sure nothing happens to it before the hearing, and I'll send word to the sheriff about the gate. You can't ride to the county seat alone again, not with everything that's happening. I rode there alone before and I'll do it again, Miriam said, with a steadiness she didn't entirely feel but refused to let show. Elias, listen to me. We don't have the luxury of being careful and safe both at once. Pick your fight. I'll handle this end of it. He looked at her for a long moment in the gray pre-dawn light, something working behind his eyes that wasn't quite fear and wasn't quite admiration, but sat somewhere uneasy between the two. 3 months ago, I didn't know you at all, he said. Now I'm trusting you with the one thing standing between us and losing everything. Then trust me, Miriam said simply, the way I'm trusting you to bring those cattle home alive. He nodded once, sharp, and turned to wake the 2 hired hands sleeping in the bunkhouse, and within 20 minutes the ranch had split into 2 desperate fronts, Elias and his men riding hard into the scattered dark after cattle that could die of thirst before noon if they weren't found fast, and Miriam saddling her own horse with the precious folder of evidence wrapped carefully in oilcloth and tucked deep in her saddlebag, riding alone toward the county seat with the rising sun at her back and a knot of fear sitting hard in her chest that she refused to let slow her down. She made it to Caro's office by mid-morning, exhausted and dust-covered, and relayed everything: the cut gate, the scattered cattle, her growing certainty that Silas Granger was no longer simply hiding his theft, but actively moving to stop them before the hearing could happen at all. Caro's expression hardened as he listened. This changes things. If we can connect last night's sabotage directly to Granger, that's not just fraud anymore. That's witness intimidation, obstruction. He shook his head, but connecting it directly will be hard. Men like him don't cut gates themselves. They pay someone else to do it and make sure their own hands stay clean. Then we don't need to prove he cut it, Miriam said. We need to make sure it doesn't stop us from getting to that hearing. It almost did anyway. Sheriff Daniel Bowes, when Miriam rode to his office to formally report the sabotage, listened to her account with a politeness that didn't quite mask his skepticism, and within 2 days Miriam understood with a sinking certainty exactly why. Bowes had been, she learned through careful inquiry, a frequent recipient of Silas Granger's hospitality over the years. Hunting trips, favors, the kind of casual friendship that didn't show up on any ledger but shaped a man's instincts all the same. The accusation, when it came, arrived almost exactly as Caro had warned it might. 3 days before the scheduled hearing, Sheriff Bowes rode out to Thornridge Ranch himself, his expression carefully neutral, and informed Elias that a formal complaint had been filed against him. Theft of cattle from a neighboring property, supposedly witnessed by 2 men Miriam had never heard of. Men who turned out, upon Caro's quiet investigation, to have financial ties to Silas Granger that went back years. It's a lie, Elias said, standing in his own yard, fury barely restrained beneath the careful calm he was forcing into his voice. Every word of it is a lie, Daniel, and you know me well enough to know it. I know you, Elias, Bowes said, not quite meeting his eyes. But I've got 2 sworn statements and a complaint filed proper, and I've got a job to do regardless of what I personally believe. You understand I can't just look the other way on something filed this formal. It was a warning shot, Miriam understood, watching from the porch with her arms crossed tight against her chest, fighting to keep her own fury contained. Silas Granger, sensing the walls closing in, had reached for the only tool left to him, using the machinery of the law itself to discredit and distract the very people trying to expose him, buying time, sowing doubt, hoping the accusation alone would be enough to make the county doubt Elias's credibility before he ever stepped into that courtroom to contest his own stolen water rights. It didn't work, not entirely, though it came closer than Miriam wanted to admit. The accusation spread through Drystone Crossing within a day, the way every piece of gossip did. And for the first time since the wedding, Miriam felt the old familiar weight of public judgment pressing in again, sharper now, uglier, because this time it wasn't simply about her appearance or her grief, but about whether her husband was a thief and a liar. "Let them talk," Elias said grimly, the night before the hearing, both of them sitting up late at the kitchen table, too tense for sleep. "Talk's cheap. Tomorrow we bring facts." "And if facts aren't enough? If the room's already decided before we walk in?" "Then we make them listen anyway," Elias said, and there was something in his voice, steady and unyielding, that reminded Miriam powerfully of the church, of the moment he'd silenced an entire room without raising his voice. "You taught me that, Miriam. Numbers don't lie, even when people do. We've got the numbers. We've got the documents. We've got Caro. That's more than Silas thought we'd ever manage to put together." The courthouse, the morning of the hearing, was more crowded than either of them expected. Word of the dispute, the accusations, the scandal brewing beneath Drystone Crossing's respectable surface had traveled fast enough that half the county seemed to have found some excuse to be present. Miriam felt the weight of every eye as she walked in beside Elias, the same kind of public spectacle she'd endured at her own wedding, except this time the stakes weren't her dignity alone, but everything they'd built together since. Silas Granger sat across the room with an expensive lawyer beside him, a sharp-suited man from the county seat named Tobias Reed, who carried himself with the particular smugness of someone confident the matter would resolve quickly and favorably. Silas himself looked almost relaxed, his mustache neatly trimmed as always, nodding politely to acquaintances in the crowd, like a man attending a social gathering rather than facing a formal challenge to his integrity. The judge, a stern gray-haired woman named Judge Eleanor Whitfield, called the proceedings to order, and Reed wasted no time launching his opening salvo, not against the evidence itself, but against Miriam. "Your Honor," Reed began, his voice carrying easily through the crowded room, "before we entertain serious accusations against a respected member of this community, I think it's worth examining the source of these claims. Mrs. Thornridge married into this family a matter of months ago. A widow with no formal education in finance or law, by her own admission, attempting to challenge 20 years of trusted service to this county." "Objection to relevance, Your Honor," Caro said, rising calmly. "Mrs. Thornridge's marital history and education have no bearing on whether the documents she's uncovered are accurate." "Sustained," Whitfield said with a sharp look toward Reed. "Counsel will confine remarks to the evidence." But Reed pressed on anyway, in subtler ways throughout the morning. Pointed questions about Miriam's background, gentle insinuations about a grieving widow's state of mind, comments calculated to make the room doubt her competence and her motives without ever quite crossing the line into something Caro could formally object to. Miriam felt every barb land, felt the old familiar heat of public humiliation rising in her chest, the same cruel undercurrent she'd endured her entire life in this town. She didn't let it show. She'd buried a husband and a child. She had survived worse than a courtroom full of whispers. When her turn came to testify, she walked to the stand with her spine straight, the same way she'd walked into that church months earlier, and she answered every question Reed threw at her with calm, unshakable precision, never raising her voice, never letting his condescension provoke her into anything but careful, devastating accuracy. "Mrs. Thornridge," Reed said, his tone dripping with practiced skepticism, "you'd have this court believe that a woman with no formal training somehow uncovered a fraud that escaped the notice of bankers, county officials, and your own husband for 2 full years?" "I'd have this court believe what the documents themselves prove, Mr. Reed," Miriam answered, steady and clear. "I'm happy to walk through every figure, every filing, every discrepancy, line by line, for as long as the court requires. Numbers don't require formal training to add correctly. They only require someone willing to actually look." She did exactly that for the better part of an hour, walking Judge Whitfield through the ledger discrepancies, the non-existent Larkspur Trading Company, the forged signature on the water rights filing. Caro had secured a handwriting expert by then, who testified that the signature bore clear, identifiable differences from Elias's verified handwriting on file with the bank. She laid out Dorothy Pike's account of her brother-in-law's ruined ranch, the suspiciously similar pattern of debts and disputes that had preceded its loss. And then, exactly as Caro had hoped, the unexpected witnesses began stepping forward. A bank clerk from a neighboring county, contacted quietly by Caro in the preceding days, testified to having processed payments from Silas Granger's accounts into Larkspur Trading under circumstances that matched almost exactly the pattern in Thornridge Ranch's ledgers. A rancher from 2 counties over, who'd lost a modest spread under remarkably similar conditions 5 years earlier, stood to testify about the manager who'd handled his finances during that loss, Silas Granger, by name. A former associate of Silas's, a man who'd once worked alongside him managing accounts before a falling out. Neither party had ever publicly explained, came forward with records of his own, hinting at a pattern stretching back further than anyone in Dry Stone Crossing had ever suspected. By the time the morning stretched into afternoon, the courtroom that had arrived to watch Elias and Miriam Thornridge humiliated had transformed into something else entirely. A room watching, in stunned, gathering silence, the slow and complete unraveling of a man who'd spent 20 years building a reputation on careful, patient deception. Silas Granger's composed smile had vanished hours ago. He sat now, with his jaw tight, his eyes darting occasionally toward the door, like a man calculating whether escape remained an option, while his expensive lawyer scribbled increasingly desperate notes that did nothing to slow the steady accumulation of evidence piling up against his client. Judge Whitfield called a recess as the afternoon light began slanting long through the courthouse windows, her expression giving away nothing. But Miriam, watching her gather her notes with brisk, deliberate movements, felt something settle in her chest that hadn't been there in months. Not victory yet. Not quite. But something close to it. Something earned through weeks of careful, patient, unglamorous work that nobody in this room had thought a plus-size widow capable of managing. Elias found her hand beneath the table during the recess, gripping it tight, and when she looked at him, she saw something in his face that hadn't been there even in their quietest, most trusting moments at the ranch. Something that looked unmistakably like wonder. "You did this," he said quietly. "All of this. You did this for me. For both of us," Miriam corrected, and outside the courthouse windows, the long Montana afternoon stretched on, the air still thick with drought and dust and the unfinished business of a reckoning that wasn't quite over yet, but had for the first time tipped decisively toward the truth. The recess lasted less than an hour, but it felt to Miriam like the longest stretch of her life, longer even than the night she'd spent sitting up beside her daughter's sickbed, because at least in those nights there had been nothing left to do but wait. Here, in the hallway outside the courtroom, there was still the terrible possibility that all of it, the ledgers, the forged signature, the witnesses, the months of careful work, might not be enough. She'd seen the way Reed kept glancing toward Silas, calculating, recalculating, a man trying to find some angle left to play. There wasn't one. When Judge Whitfield called the room back to order, her face had the particular stillness of someone who'd already made up her mind and was only going through the formal motions of saying so out loud. "In all my years on this bench," she said, "I don't believe I've seen a more thoroughly documented case of financial fraud brought before this court by a private citizen with no legal training. Mrs. Thornridge, your work today was meticulous, and this court takes note of it." Miriam felt Elias's hand tighten around hers beneath the table. Whitfield's gaze moved to Silas, and whatever warmth had been in her voice a moment before disappeared entirely. "Mr. Granger, the evidence presented today, the falsified ledger entries, the fabricated supplier, the forged signature on a water rights transfer, and testimony connecting you to a documented pattern of similar conduct in at least 2 other counties, leaves this court no reasonable doubt as to the nature of what's occurred here. The water rights filing is voided, effective immediately, and full rights are restored to Thornridge Ranch under the original filing held by Elias Thornridge's late father." A murmur rippled through the courtroom, and Miriam realized she'd been holding her breath without noticing. "Furthermore," Whitfield continued, "given the scope and apparent duration of this conduct, I'm ordering a full criminal investigation into Mr. Granger's financial dealings. both within this county and in coordination with authorities in any jurisdiction where similar complaints may exist. Mr. Granger, you are to surrender any financial power of attorney currently held over client accounts, effective today, and you will remain within this county pending further proceedings. Reed was on his feet immediately, already speaking about appeals, about insufficient time to prepare a defense, but his voice had lost its earlier confidence, thinning out into something closer to noise than argument. Whitfield silenced him with a single look and brought the gavel down. It was over. Or it felt over in that first dizzy moment, though Miriam understood even as the courtroom began to empty around them that the real consequences would take weeks, maybe months, to fully unfold. The criminal investigation. The accounting of exactly how much had been stolen, from how many people, over how many years. The slow process of repair that came after any reckoning this size. Silas didn't look at them as he was escorted out by the sheriff's deputy, his composure finally, completely gone. His shoulders hunched in a way that made him look smaller than Miriam had ever seen him, smaller than the easy, confident man who'd ridden out to their ranch with his polished boots and his rehearsed explanations. She felt, watching him go, not triumph exactly, but something quieter, a kind of exhausted relief. The feeling of finally setting down a weight she hadn't realized she'd been carrying with both arms for weeks. "It's done," Elias said beside her, his voice hoarse, like the words cost him something to say out loud. "Miriam, it's actually done?" "Most of it," she said. "The hard part, anyway." He turned to look at her then, right there in the half-emptied courtroom, with Dorothy Pike and the bank clerk and the rancher from 2 counties over still milling nearby. And he didn't seem to care who saw when he pulled her into an embrace that had nothing careful or restrained about it. His arms tight around her, his face pressed briefly against her hair. "I don't know how to thank you for this," he said quietly, just for her. "I don't think I have the words for it." "You don't need words," Miriam said, and found, to her own surprise, that she meant it completely. The ride home that evening was quiet, but it was a different kind of quiet than the silence that had carried them to the ranch on their wedding day months earlier. Elias's hands men had recovered most of the scattered cattle over the preceding days, exhausted but largely successful. And what greeted them at Thornridge Ranch as the sun dropped low and orange over the western hills was a property still standing, still theirs, with a future in front of it for the first time in longer than either of them wanted to admit. The weeks that followed brought changes that arrived slower than the courtroom verdict, but ran, in their own way, just as deep. Word of what had happened spread through Drystone Crossing with the same hungry speed that any scandal traveled in a small town. Except this time, the story wasn't about a plus-size widow forced into an embarrassing marriage. It was about a woman who'd uncovered a fraud that had apparently touched half the ranchers in the county at one time or another, who'd ridden alone to the county seat not once but twice, who'd sat calm and unshaken through a lawyer's deliberate cruelty and come out the other side with every fact in order. The town didn't transform overnight. Miriam wasn't foolish enough to expect that, and she'd have distrusted it if it had happened that fast. But the change came anyway, in small accumulating pieces. Women who'd once crossed the street to avoid her now nodded when she passed, sometimes even stopped to ask, carefully, almost shyly, how she'd managed to spot what nobody else had seen in 2 years of Silas Granger's careful work. "I just looked," Miriam told them, more than once, in those early weeks. That's all it ever takes, most of the time. Somebody willing to actually look instead of trusting that everything's fine, because it's easier than asking questions. Dorothy Pike became something closer to a real friend than Miriam had expected, the two of them meeting more regularly now, not just at the shared fence line hanging laundry, but over coffee, over the particular kind of conversation that grows between women who've watched each other through something hard. It was Dorothy who first brought word, a month after the hearing, that her brother-in-law in Wyoming had written, asking whether the Thornridge case might help him pursue some recovery of his own lost ranch, whether Caro might take his case too, now that there was precedent and a documented pattern to point to. "Funny thing," Dorothy said, stirring sugar into her coffee at the Thornridge kitchen table, the same table where Miriam had once pored over ledgers by candlelight, suspicious and alone. "Folks used to look at you and see somebody who needed pity. Now half the county's asking how to get 5 minutes of your time to look over their own books. I'm not sure I want that kind of reputation," Miriam said, though there was no real reluctance in it. more a kind of bemused surprise at how completely her standing in this town had shifted. Reputation's not something you get to choose, Miriam. Only thing you get to choose is whether you earned it. Dorothy smiled, the expression carrying real warmth now, where once there had been only careful, distant courtesy. You earned this one. The financial reckoning, when it finally came, proved more complicated and more far-reaching than even Caro had initially anticipated. The criminal investigation into Silas Granger's affairs uncovered not 2 ruined ranches, but 4, stretching back nearly 15 years, a pattern of careful, patient theft, dressed up as trusted management, preying specifically on ranchers weakened by injury, illness, or grief, men and women too exhausted by their own circumstances to look closely at the hands holding their finances together. Silas, facing the mounting weight of evidence and the very real prospect of a lengthy prison sentence, eventually agreed through his attorney to a settlement that stripped him of his remaining assets, surrendered his professional license permanently, and committed him to a restitution schedule that would, Caro estimated, take years to fully repay what had been stolen across all 4 ranches combined. It wasn't perfect justice. Miriam understood that some of what had been lost, the years, the stress, the particular damage done to men like Elias who'd trusted completely and paid for it, could never really be restored by any settlement, no matter how thorough. But it was something. It was Thornridge Ranch standing whole again, water rights restored, the books finally clean and transparent, a future in front of them that no longer depended on the goodwill of a man who'd spent 2 decades quietly robbing the people who trusted him most. Silas left the county entirely before the year was out, the particular kind of disappearance that happens when a man's name has become too poisoned in a place for him to ever rebuild what he lost. Miriam heard secondhand through Dorothy that he'd gone east somewhere, taken a clerking job under circumstances considerably more modest than the comfortable respectability he'd enjoyed in Drystone Crossing for 20 years. She didn't feel much of anything hearing it. Whatever satisfaction she might have once imagined taking in his downfall had already been spent in the courtroom watching his composure crack piece by piece under the weight of evidence she'd gathered herself, candle by candle, ledger page by ledger page. What mattered more to her, in the months that followed, was watching Elias come back to himself in ways she hadn't fully realized he'd lost. He'd been a man bent under more than just his bad leg, she understood now, looking back. Bent under the slow accumulation of failures he'd believed were his own fault. The gradual collapse of a ranch he'd assumed was simply the inevitable result of his injury and his own inadequacy, never once suspecting that someone he trusted had been actively working to ensure that collapse continued. Watching the truth come out hadn't just freed the ranch from Silas's theft. It had freed Elias from a particular corrosive kind of shame he'd been carrying silently for 2 years, the belief that he alone had failed to hold his father's legacy together. I used to lie awake some nights, he admitted to her one evening, the 2 of them sitting on the porch as the late summer light stretched long and gold across pasture that finally, blessedly, looked healthier than it had in months, thinking I just wasn't man enough to keep this place running, that my leg had taken more from me than just the use of it proper, that maybe my father would have looked at what I'd let this ranch become and been ashamed of me. Your father would have been proud you trusted a friend, Miriam said. That's not weakness, Elias. Trusting people is supposed to be safe. The fact that it wasn't this time isn't a mark against your character. It's a mark against his. Took me a while to believe that. He looked over at her, something soft and unguarded in his expression that she'd grown accustomed to seeing more and more often these past weeks. Still working on it some days. Some days are like that, Miriam said. I know something about needing a while to believe good things again. He reached over and took her hand, the gesture familiar now, comfortable in a way it hadn't been those first uncertain weeks of their marriage. You rebuilt more than the books, Miriam. You rebuilt this whole place, me included. She didn't have an easy answer for that, so she simply let her hand stay in his, watching the sun drop slow behind the hills, the ranch around them quiet and settled in a way it hadn't been since long before she'd ever arrived. The practical changes came steadily through the rest of that year. With the water rights secured and Silas's theft finally exposed and stopped, the ranch's actual financial position turned out to be considerably better than either of them had dared hope. Not wealthy, not by any means, but stable, solvent, capable of weathering even a drought this severe, without the constant threat of collapse hanging over every decision. Elias hired a new accountant, a careful Unassuming woman from the county seat who insisted on monthly reviews with both Elias and Miriam present, no exceptions, no single person ever again holding unsupervised control over the ranch's finances. Miriam took to the bookkeeping with an ease that surprised even her, finding genuine satisfaction in the steady, methodical work of tracking expenses and income, watching the numbers slowly tell a story of recovery instead of decline. It wasn't glamorous work. It wasn't the kind of thing anyone in Drystone Crossing would have predicted. Watching her walk up those church steps months earlier in a dress that didn't fit right, mocked and dismissed before the ceremony had even properly begun. But it was hers, earned through long nights and careful attention, and there was a particular satisfaction in that nobody could take away from her now. The town's shift in opinion, gradual as it had been, eventually crystallized into something more concrete than mere politeness on the street. By early autumn, 3 separate ranching families had approached Miriam directly, asking, with the particular awkwardness of people unused to admitting they needed help, whether she might look over their own books, their own arrangements, in light of everything Silas Granger's exposure had revealed about how easily trust could be exploited in this county. She helped where she could, never charging more than what felt fair, building slowly a quiet reputation as someone whose judgment on financial matters could be trusted precisely because she'd proven, under the worst possible scrutiny, that she looked at facts honestly even when the truth was uncomfortable. "Funny how things turn," Elias observed one evening, watching her work through a neighboring rancher's books at their own kitchen table, the same table where this whole fight had begun. "Town spent years treating you like you had nothing to offer. Now half of them can't manage their own affairs without your eye on it." "Town was wrong about a lot of things," Miriam said, not looking up from her work. "Mostly wrong about what makes a person worth something. They were measuring me by my dress size and my widow's grief. Should have been measuring whether I could add a column of numbers straight and tell the truth when it mattered." "I measured wrong too at first," Elias admitted. "Standing up in that church, I wasn't thinking about what kind of partner you'd turn out to be. I was just angry at how they were treating you. Took me a while to understand I'd married someone who'd end up saving everything I had left." Miriam finally looked up at that, something warm catching in her chest at the plain, unguarded honesty in his voice. "You stood up for me before you had any reason to know what I was capable of. That mattered more than you probably realize, Elias. Nobody had done that for me in longer than I want to admit." "Glad I did it then," he said simply. "Best decision I made that whole miserable day." Autumn deepened across Thornridge Ranch with a kind of quiet, steady prosperity. Neither of them had dared imagine possible during those desperate weeks of courtroom battles and forged signatures and cattle scattered wild across drought-cracked range. The herd, recovered and properly fed, now that the ranch's actual resources were no longer being quietly siphoned away, began to show real health for the first time in years. The water from Cutter Creek, rightfully restored, ran steady enough to carry them through even the lean months ahead, and though the drought itself hadn't broken yet, there was a different quality to how Elias and Miriam faced it now. Not the desperate, exhausted survival of 2 years under Silas Granger's hidden theft, but the steady, confident endurance of 2 people who finally understood exactly what they were working with and exactly who they could trust to help carry the weight. What had begun as a marriage ordered by a town council that saw Miriam Holloway as nothing more than an inconvenient burden to offload had become, slowly and without either of them quite marking the exact moment it happened, something neither of them had expected to find again after everything they'd separately lost. Not a transaction, not an arrangement of convenience. Something built, piece by piece, out of trust freely given and proven worthy, out of 2 damaged people choosing, again and again, to stand beside each other instead of facing their separate griefs alone. The respect Miriam had earned from Drystone Crossing mattered to her less than she might once have expected. What mattered more, sitting on that porch in the gold autumn light, with Elias's hand warm around hers, and the ranch around them finally, truly stable, was the particular, hard-won knowledge that she had not been wrong to hope for something better than the life the town had tried to assign her. She had been underestimated her entire life, by people who measured her worth in pounds and grief and widowhood instead of in courage or persistence, or the simple, stubborn refusal to look away from a wrong that needed righting. They had been wrong about her, every single one of them. And for the first time since she'd buried her daughter beneath the cold Montana ground, Miriam Holloway Thornridge allowed herself to believe that the worst chapters of her life might, finally, be behind her. Winter came hard that year, the way it always did in Montana once the season finally turned. But it came to a ranch that was ready for it in a way Thornridge Ranch hadn't been ready for anything in longer than Miriam wanted to count. The barn no longer leaned quite so badly to the east, Elias and the hired hands having spent a good stretch of autumn shoring up the foundation with lumber they could actually afford now, that money wasn't quietly disappearing into accounts that didn't exist. The fences ran straight and mended along the property line. The cattle, fed properly through a season that hadn't been kind to anyone's herd, carried enough weight on their bones to survive the cold months ahead without the constant gnawing fear that had haunted every winter since Elias's accident. It wasn't ease, exactly. Ranching never offered that, not even in the best years. And this one had its own share of hard mornings, frozen pipes, a sick calf that kept Elias up 2 nights running in the barn, with Miriam bringing out coffee and blankets she insisted he actually use. But it was a different kind of hard now. The ordinary hard of honest work instead of the slow, hidden hard of being quietly robbed by someone you trusted. And Miriam had learned enough about both kinds to know which one she could live with. Spring arrived late, the way it sometimes did after a winter that dragged its feet. But when it came with something neither of them had dared hope for after 3 years of relentless drought. The rain started in March, gentle at first, then building through April into the kind of steady, soaking storms that the whole county had been praying for without much real expectation of an answer. Cutter Creek, running full and strong now under rights that legally and permanently belonged to Thornridge Ranch, swelled past its drought-shrunken banks for the first time in years, carrying real water out across pasture that had forgotten what abundance felt like. Miriam stood at the kitchen window one gray morning in early May, watching rain sheet down across the yard in steady curtains, and felt something loosen in her chest that she hadn't fully realized was still tight after everything. Elias came up behind her, his bad leg adjusted now to a careful, steady gait that had grown stronger over the winter with rest and proper care, and rested his hand against the small of her back. "Look at that," he said quietly. 3 years? I'd nearly forgotten what real rain even sounded like. "It's a good sound," Miriam said. "Best one I know," he agreed, and they stood there a while longer, just watching, just listening, the particular companionable silence that had become the most natural language between them. It was around that same time, in the muddy, hopeful early weeks of spring, that Elias announced he wanted to replace the entrance sign at the front of the property, the old weathered board that had hung there since his father's time. Thornridge Ranch, burned into wood that had gone gray and splintered with decades of sun and neglect. He didn't tell Miriam exactly what he intended, only that he'd be gone most of a day in town seeing to it, and she didn't press, assuming he simply wanted fresh paint, fresh wood, something to mark the ranch's recovery the way a man marks any new chapter worth remembering. What he brought home, 3 days later, strapped carefully across the back of the wagon, made her stand very still in the muddy yard for a long moment before she trusted herself to speak. The new sign read, Holloway Thornridge Ranch, the letters carved deep and clean into fresh oak, no longer just his father's name carried forward alone, but both their names standing together, equal weight, equal claim. "Elias," she said, her voice catching in a way she hadn't expected. "You didn't have to do this." "I know I didn't have to," he said, climbing down from the wagon with the careful, practiced movement his legs still required. "Wanted to, anyway. This ranch wouldn't exist anymore if it weren't for you, Miriam. Wouldn't be right, hanging a sign out front that pretends otherwise. You're not just my wife keeping house. You're an owner of this place, same as me, and I want every person who rides up that road to know it plain without having to ask." "The town's going to talk," she said, though there was no real worry in it, more wonder than anything else. "Town's been talking since the day we married," Elias said, a faint, crooked smile pulling at his mouth. "Let them talk about something true for a change." They hung the sign together that afternoon, the rain having finally let up into a soft gray mist, Elias holding the post steady while Miriam tightened the final bolts, both of them soaked through and muddy and laughing in a way that had nothing performative about it, nothing for anyone else's benefit, just two people who'd fought hard for something and were finally, simply glad to have it. It was that evening, sitting on the porch with the mist still clinging low over the pasture and the smell of wet earth thick in the air, that Elias finally said the thing Miriam had felt building between them for months without either of them naming it directly. "I need to tell you something," he said, turning his hat over slowly in his hands, the way he did when something mattered enough to make him nervous. "Been meaning to say it for a while now, and I keep finding reasons to put it off, but I figure there's no perfect moment coming, so it might as well be tonight." "You're scaring me a little," Miriam said, echoing, without quite meaning to, the same words he'd said to her the night she'd first laid out the evidence against Silas. "Nothing scary about it, just true." He set the hat aside, finally looked at her directly, the particular steady honesty in his eyes that she'd come to trust more than almost anything else in her life. "Somewhere between you showing up that ledger by candlelight and us standing in that courthouse together, and probably 100 ordinary evenings since that I didn't think to mark the exact date of, I fell in love with you, Miriam. Completely. I don't know exactly when it started. I just know it's true now, and I didn't want to keep carrying it around unsaid." Miriam sat with that for a moment, feeling the particular fullness of a heart she'd thought 2 years earlier might never have room for anything but grief again. She thought of the church, of a marriage that had begun as a punishment dressed up as charity, two strangers thrown together by a town that saw them both as problems to be solved rather than people. She thought of how far they'd traveled since, through ledgers and courtrooms and a cut Watergate and 100 quiet suppers where trust had built itself slow and steady, the way anything worth keeping usually does. "I love you too," she said, and the words came easier than she expected, simple and certain, none of the hesitation she might have predicted from a woman who'd buried this kind of feeling once already and wasn't sure it could survive being dug back up. "I think I have for a while now. Didn't want to say it first in case it scared you off." Elias laughed, low and warm, and reached for her hand. "Nothing about you has ever scared me off, Miriam. Not from the first day you showed up swinging that broom around my kitchen like the place owed you something." "It did owe me something," she said. "Owed me a chance to matter again, same as I owed it a chance to be saved." They sat together as the evening deepened into full dark, the rain starting up again soft against the porch roof, and Miriam found herself thinking, not for the first time, about everything the town of Drystone Crossing had gotten wrong about her on that first miserable wedding day. They'd looked at her and seen a burden, a woman too broken by grief, too far past her prime, too much in every wrong way to be worth anything but pity and quiet disposal. They'd married her off like a problem being solved through bureaucratic convenience, never once imagining that the woman they were so eager to offload might be exactly the person their own community would eventually need. It was a peculiar kind of lesson, the kind life seemed to deliver mostly to people who'd already survived more than their fair share of unfairness, that the value a person carried inside them had nothing at all to do with how easily the world chose to dismiss them. Miriam had walked into that church a widow nobody wanted, weighed down by grief and judgment, and a body the whole town seemed to think disqualified her from being taken seriously. She walked out of that same courthouse, months later, having dismantled a fraud that 4 separate ranching families had been too exhausted, too trusting, or too distracted by their own grief to ever catch on their own. Worth wasn't something other people got to assign. She understood that now in a way she hadn't fully grasped before. Not even in the quiet, private resolve of those early candlelit nights with the ledger. It was something a person discovered through the simple, stubborn act of refusing to disappear just because the world had decided they should. The following months brought the kind of steady, unglamorous prosperity that Miriam found she valued more than she ever would have predicted, back in her old life with Thomas, when she'd assumed contentment looked like something grander than mended fences and healthy cattle and a ledger book that finally, honestly, balanced. The herd grew through that spring and summer, strong calves dropping steady through the warm months, the kind of natural increase that came easy to a ranch no longer being quietly bled dry from the inside. Crop yields from the small fields Elias planted for feed came in better than they had in years, helped along by rains that kept falling through the season with a generosity the drought-worn county hadn't dared expect. Word of the Thornridge case, meanwhile, had rippled outward through that whole stretch of Montana in ways neither Miriam nor Elias had fully anticipated. 2 more ranching families, beyond the 4 directly connected to Silas Granger's documented fraud, came forward over the following year with their own suspicions about financial managers handling their affairs, prompted, they said plainly, By hearing what one determined woman had managed to uncover with nothing but careful attention and the willingness to actually look at the numbers instead of trusting a smooth voice and a confident smile, Miriam found herself, almost without quite choosing it, becoming something like an informal authority on the subject in that corner of the county. Not a lawyer, not an accountant by training, just a woman who understood, better than most, exactly how easily trust could be weaponized against people too tired or too grieving or too injured to watch their own affairs as closely as they should. She gave what advice she could, free more often than not, finding in it a particular satisfaction that had nothing to do with the respect it earned her, and everything to do with knowing she was helping make sure what happened to Elias didn't happen quite so easily to someone else. "You ever think about what you'd be doing right now?" Elias asked her one evening, the two of them walking the fence line together in the long gold light of late summer, checking for storm damage after a hard rain the night before. "If the council had never forced this marriage on us? If you just stayed in town, alone, the way you were before?" Miriam considered the question seriously, the way she considered most things he asked her. "Surviving, probably. I was good at surviving. Hadn't figured out yet how to do much more than that." She glanced over at him, at the steady, settled way he carried himself now, so different from the wary, defensive man she'd met on those church steps. "What about you? Where do you figure you'd be?" "Honestly?" He was quiet a moment, considering. Probably would have lost this ranch within the year. Silas would have finished what he started, water rights gone, debts piling up faster than I could have managed alone, and I'd have ended up selling out cheap to whoever was standing closest when the bank came calling. Wouldn't have known what hit me until it was already done. "The town thought they were doing you a favor," Miriam said, "forcing a wife on you instead of letting you struggle along alone." Funny, considering they thought they were doing me the bigger favor, getting an unwanted widow off the parish charity rolls. "Funny how wrong people can be," Elias said, "even when they think they're being practical." He reached over, took her hand the way he so often did now, easy and unthinking, the gesture worn comfortable through a year of practice. "Best decision that council ever made, much as I hate giving Caldwell and the rest of them any credit for it." "They didn't make the decision," Miriam pointed out. "We did. Every day since. The council just opened a door. What walked through it was up to us." It was, she thought, the truest accounting of the whole story she could offer, the kind of clarity that only came with distance and time to properly weigh what had actually mattered in the long run. A council had ordered a marriage out of convenience and prejudice, never imagining or caring what might come of throwing two damaged, struggling people together. But everything that followed, the trust built slow and careful over shared work, the courage it took to chase down proof of a fraud nobody else had noticed, the partnership forged in courtrooms and cattle drives and quiet kitchen conversations that mattered more than either of them had expected, none of that had been ordered by anyone. That part, the part that actually counted, they'd built themselves, choice by choice, refusing every day to settle for the bare minimum the town expected of their arrangement. By the time autumn rolled back around, a full year and more removed from that humiliating wedding day, Thornridge Ranch, Holloway Thornridge Ranch, the sign out front declared plainly to anyone who cared to read it, stood as one of the more solid, well-run properties in the whole valley, a turnaround so complete that even the families who'd once whispered cruelest about Miriam at her own wedding had taken, grudgingly or otherwise, to asking her opinion on matters of business and household management neither of them would have dreamed of doing 18 months earlier. Miriam didn't need their approval anymore. She'd stopped needing it somewhere around the time she'd sat calm and unshaken through Tobias Reed's deliberate cruelty in that courtroom, understanding finally and completely that her worth had never actually depended on what Drystone Crossing thought of her size, her grief, or her circumstances. But there was something satisfying anyway in watching the same people who'd dismissed her now seek her out, not because she needed the validation, but because it proved, plainly and undeniably, that the town's old assumptions about who deserved respect and who didn't had been built on nothing sturdier than prejudice and convenience all along. On a clear evening in late September, with the harvest mostly in and the cattle fat and healthy heading into another winter that no longer felt like a looming threat, Elias and Miriam stood together at the edge of Cutter Creek, watching the water run clean and strong toward the horizon, carrying with it everything the drought had once threatened to take, and the fraud had nearly succeeded in stealing outright. 3 years ago, Elias said, watching the current move steady over smooth stones, I'd have told you this ranch was finished. Just a matter of time before the bank or the drought or my own bad leg took the rest of what my father built. And now? Now I figure it's just getting started, he said. And there was nothing forced or performative in the way he said it, just plain, settled conviction. Whatever comes next, harder winters, leaner years, whatever this land decides to throw at us, I figure we'll manage it, together. That's the part that's different now. Not that nothing hard will ever happen again, just that I won't be facing it alone, wondering if I'm man enough to hold it all together by myself. Nobody's meant to hold everything together alone, Miriam said. That was the town's whole mistake about both of us, I think. Treating us like burdens that needed managing instead of people who just needed somebody willing to stand beside us. Elias turned to look at her, the late golden light catching the lines of his face, the particular steadiness that had replaced the wary defensiveness of the man she'd married a year and a half earlier. Best thing that ever happened to me, he said quietly, was a council deciding to punish a widow they didn't know what to do with by marrying her off to a cripple they'd already written off. Funny how the worst intentions sometimes build the best things, if the right two people decide to make something real out of it. We made something real, Miriam agreed, and there was no hesitation in it, no lingering doubt of the kind that had once kept her awake those early nights in an unfamiliar bed, married to a stranger, wondering what kind of life she'd been forced into. Built it ourselves, out of ledgers and courtrooms and 100 ordinary evenings nobody else was watching. The water kept moving past them, steady and sure, carrying the particular quiet wisdom that comes only from having survived something hard enough to test what a person was actually made of. Miriam Holloway, once dismissed as nothing more than an unwanted widow, too broken by grief and too inconvenient in body to be worth the town's patience, had become the woman who'd saved an entire ranch from ruin, exposed a fraud that had quietly devastated 4 families across the county, and in the process, discovered a partnership built not on pity or obligation, but on earned respect and a love neither of them had expected to find again after everything they'd separately buried. True worth, she understood now, standing beside the man who'd once silenced an entire church on her behalf and had spent every day since proving that moment hadn't been an empty gesture, was never measured by the things a small, frightened town chose to mock. Not by a dress that didn't fit right, not by a widow's grief, not by the careless cruelty of people who'd never once had to fight as hard for anything as she'd fought for this. It was measured by what a person did when nobody expected anything from them at all, by the courage to keep looking when everyone else had already decided to look away. The Holloway Thornridge sign held steady against the autumn wind, 2 names standing equal at the gate of a ranch neither of them had built alone. And beneath the wide Montana sky, the water ran clean toward a future that finally, after everything, belonged completely to both of them.